Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Green Book Podcast. I'm Karen Lynch hosting this episode. Super excited to be here. But I want to give a little disclaimer before we begin about what we're talking about today and then introduce you to our guest. If you haven't been paying attention, survey fraud is one of the most persistent threats to our industry, to the credibility of research right now. There's been a stressful several months, I would say, since some scandals have come out, and I've been talking to the team at Rep Data really since May about some of the work they're doing in this space. They have now published their State of Fraud 2025 report, or maybe it hasn't been published yet, but I've seen a pre-copy, so we can talk about that. More than 4 billion survey attempts worldwide were scanned for this initiative. And Steven Snell, who's the head of research at Rep Data, is here to join us to talk a little bit about what they uncovered in this report. We'll talk about the methodology. We'll talk about the implications. But really, the big caveat is what does the industry do next? So first of all, Steven, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Karen. It's great to be here to talk about such a icky topic, right?
Icky topic. It's one of those things where it could make us really crazy if we think too much about it, because it's infuriating, right? It's infuriating that fraud exists. So before we get too into that, though, why don't you, I briefly just said, you're head of research at Rep Data, but why don't you just take a minute and kind of level set for everybody your role, kind of what Rep Data is known for, your role there, and then we'll get into some other stuff.
Sure. So Rep Data specializes in quantitative data collection. We own Research Defender, which is a fraud prevention platform. We can talk more about what that looks like, but I actually joined Rep Data because I wanted to work on Research Defender. I was really excited about the prospect of getting my hands dirty, so to speak, and in terms of finding fraud and staying on top of what fraud looks like at any given time. It's evolved a ton. Prior to joining Rep, I was at Goldman Sachs for a few years. I ran a global survey research consultancy at the firm. I still say at the firm. It's a little bit of my trauma from being in a bank, but being at Goldman Sachs. Prior to that, I ran a global survey consultancy at Qualtrics. I helped to stand up the research services division. When I arrived, Qualtrics was already reselling panel, but we really built out that full service side of the house. And before that, I am a recovering academic. I was at Duke running, you can guess, a survey consultancy. So my background's very much in survey methodology, questionnaire design, sampling. I went to school originally to become a pollster, and I really specialized in how people think about survey questions, how they answer them, what that means. And I've brought sort of that interest in survey methodology to a career now in market research.
I love that. It's so interesting when people bring themselves to life a little differently than, what you can read on paper. So I love that intro. And I am really curious when you say, you joined the company to really work on Research Defender. I'm curious about what it was that kind of brought you to that. Is it a personal philosophy? Is it did you get a thorn in your side there? Like, what was it that made you say, you know what, I want to work in this space, in this area of the survey business?
Yeah, I think it was just I worry so much about data quality generally, and I want to be really clear. Fraud is just one piece of that, but it's the piece that for me was missing, because a lot of data quality begins with survey design and asking the right questions to the right people in the right way, having as low a respondent burden as possible. We want to make surveys easy to answer, and you get better data quality when you do. That's all the stuff that I felt like I really understood and I was expert in from my training, from my time at Qualtrics and Goldman. I really love that stuff. But the part that was always a little bit more opaque that I wanted to understand better is we've been in this system now for several years where people are aggregating sample from different sources. And, you can't say everybody's doing it, but almost everybody's doing it. And there is sometimes a lack of transparency about when that happens. And I think there's even more a lack of transparency about why it matters. And so, when I was at Qualtrics, obviously we were aggregating a sample. Qualtrics doesn't own a panel. They're doing some interesting things now with synthetic, but again, they don't own a traditional panel asset. And so when you are a consumer of panels, as so many of us are, and you might be a consumer of many panels all at once, what's going on? And for me, that's why I wanted to work on Research Defender, was to better understand what's going on in all these panels that we're working with.
Yeah. And I want to just take a minute and go back to kind of what you explained about the data quality issue. Because as you're explaining how fraud is one part of the data quality issue, and fraud is what we'll be getting into momentarily, it just dawned on me there's so much that is in your control when it comes to
Yes.
data quality as a researcher. And then there's what is not in your control. And
Yeah.
it seems to me that that is actually one of the discernment tasks that a researcher has today is, okay, what can I do? Eh, Because there's so much that I'm not in control of when it comes to fraudsters. So, anyway, just felt like sharing that and seeing if that resonates with you because that's what happened in my brain when you were talking.
Totally. It's a big problem, and I don't wanna spend too much time. I love to spend time on it, but people are like, "Whoa," because it's like, if we are writing bad surveys, if we're writing really long surveys, if we're not writing tight screeners to ensure we have the right people, if we're not doing our diligence as researchers, we're
Yeah.
always gonna get bad data quality.
Yeah.
And it is going to be, regardless of the panels we're using, the fraud detection, we're gonna get bad data quality. And I do think, and again, I don't want to get beat up for this or dragged in the comments, but you can have all the fraud prevention in place, but you can get bad data quality because of the research design. And there is an inclination right now to call anything we don't like fraud.
Mm,
And the fraud is out there, it's real. What I show in a lot of my research on research is that fraud and inattention are separate constructs. There's
yeah.
some
Yeah.
overlap. There's some fraudsters that look inattentive. There's some inattentive respondents that are fraudsters, but there's a lot distinct too.
Yeah.
And as researchers, we can help people be more attentive. We can give them a better survey experience. But separately, and right, we should,
Yes, this is a big yes and.
yes, and right, and we should worry about fraud.
Yeah. So let's talk about this report. So, State of Fraud 2025, which feels like the grand title that we all need right now because it's been a year.
Yeah.
We first started talking about this in around the time of IX North America when I became privy to the fact that you were doing this research, and we talked about when it was going to be, fielded, completed, and here we are.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell a little bit about kind of the State of Fraud report, the initiative that you took, and tell everybody what we're gonna talk about for the rest of our time.
Absolutely. So I've done a lot of research on research where the way that the Research Defender, our fraud detection platform, works is we scan, we score, we block. We see people coming in and we have a bunch of checks that we're running via API. We're looking at the technology that people are bringing to bear on the survey. We're looking at every knowable signal about their device, their browser, what we know about them as a respondent. We're looking at how they engage with an open-ended response, an open-ended question. We're looking at how hyperactive they are across projects and panels. So we're using all of those signals to make a decision in real time. Should they be allowed in or not?
Mm.
I make a lot of bad jokes, Karen. You should know I have a lot of kids, and I'm very much tell dad jokes. But I say just pick your Willy Wonka movie adaptation of preference. It's like good nut, bad nut, good egg, bad egg, whatever it is. That's what Research Defender is doing. We see the traffic coming in, and we decide in real time should they be allowed in, good egg, good nut, or not. And I do research on research where I purposely let these bad nuts in because I want to quantify how bad is the problem and how weird are the fraudsters. So all
Mm.
the research on research I've presented at IIEX, at other places, webinars that I've done in the past have been about my research on research. But it occurred to me earlier this year that we are sitting on a mountain of not survey data, but paradata, data about how the data are collected. And we have this for millions of survey attempts a day and billions a year. And so we don't have their survey responses because those belong to our clients. But we have all sorts of information about the disposition of the respondent. What tech are they bringing to bear? Are they hyperactive? Did they engage with our pre-survey open-ended question in a reasonable way? And so that's when we really got the ball rolling earlier in the year. Last year we scanned more than 3 billion survey attempts, and I thought, well, how many are we going to scan this year? Between
Mm.
January 1 and the end of August, we had scanned 4.1 billion plus survey attempts. And I thought, well, if instead we go one step up the funnel, so to speak, we're not going to look at survey responses, but we're going to look at these survey attempts. What can that teach us about fraud? And the answer is a lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
So, what were you hoping to uncover? And then we'll talk about what you did uncover. Like, did you have hypotheses going into this? Did you have just kind of a gut, like, I really want to see this in action, or what?
Yeah, I think I had a pretty curious nature going into this. I didn't have a ton of hypotheses per se, but I did want to know, like, what are the differences over time?
Mm,
January through the end of August, that's 8 months of data. Have
yep.
things changed in the past 8 months? The answer is yeah, but of course it's yes, right? I mean, the way that we think about how technology has changed, just thinking about 8 months ago, some of our work
Yeah.
processes, how different they are. Of course, fraud has changed. I
Yeah.
also wanted to know, are there big regional differences? And there are. I expected maybe a little bit more fire there, but just based on the smoke. But there are some important differences, and we can get into that. But
Yeah.
really, I wanted to know, what are the differences across time, over time, and across place. And there's some interesting findings for sure.
So let's get into some of those findings, right? Kind of big picture. And I want to talk about regionality. I want to talk about changes over time. But what was the most surprising thing you saw, or the thing that really, kind of opened your eyes and said, "Wow"? Because there's always some of that in an initiative with 4 billion data points, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one thing that just really stands out is the diversity of fraud tactics. Um, we talked about looking at the tech profile of the respondent, and there are some really exotic flags, right? And these are
Mhm.
things that just people, normal people, you and I, maybe we use a VPN for work, right? And that's the example that a lot of people like to give me. But there are a lot more exotic flags that we see all the time. Developer tools. I mean, if we start to think about sort of the less exotic to the more exotic, maybe there's folks at Greenbook that are using developer tools on a regular basis. It's weird to have developer tools open when you're taking a survey. You're
Mm,
probably looking for some hidden logic and things within that survey. um, you know, but then we start to see emulator usage and web proxies and really strange things that you don't necessarily see in an individual survey. If you are running a survey of 1,000 people, maybe you have one or two people who are using an emulator. But if you have 4 billion scans, all of a
yeah.
sudden you're looking at millions of people, or at least hundreds of thousands of people using these more exotic forms of, tech enabled fraud. And so
Mm,
that is something that really stands out just as we look at the 4 billion scans. Now, that means that for any given survey, it's probably less than 1% of
yeah.
their attempts. But these things and these users are smart. If they see a vulnerability, also, they can recalibrate and attack.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why I think it's important to evaluate and stay on top of these even sort of more fringe threats.
Yeah. One of the data points from the report, and I want to start to dig into other types of fraud that you saw as well, because so interesting. I think most people are not as educated into the myriad of types of fraud that we're talking about here. So, um, one of the highlights is that a third of survey attempts are fraudulent. Another 27% come from inattentive respondents. So maybe not fraudulent, but not what you want, right?
Not what you want.
Like,
Yeah.
maybe their intentions just are really just to get the money right at the end. So talk to me a little bit about how you interpret those numbers, and kind of what your thoughts about them are.
Yeah. So that those numbers actually come from several research on research studies I've done now, where I have the benefit of the responses. And I can say, all right, maybe a third of these respondents got flagged by Research Defender. But absent Research Defender, would they have been picked up in data cleaning? And the answer often is no. So that 27 and that 33% number, there is some overlap, but
Mm,
it's 10% of all the respondents are overlap. So
mm,
17% of the inattentive respondents aren't fraudsters. 17 of that 27 are not fraudsters. And on the other hand, 23 of that 33 picked up by Research Defender is clean. It
yeah,
looks good. And so I think the really difficult thing, and it's kind of where we started, which is not all bad data quality, not all bad data is fraud. I do think all fraud is bad data. And
yeah,
that's where I'm pretty, I wax evangelical on this point to some degree, because sometimes we will find fraud that people say, well, it looks okay. Like, of course it is. Fraudsters aren't stupid on average. They're getting smarter all the time. They know not to speed. They know not to straight line. They know not to give garbage open ends. So, a lot of the things that survey researchers have used traditionally, and not just in market research, polling, and all sorts of user research, a lot of these checks that we've had for data quality are really inadequate to address fraud because fraudsters are increasingly giving good looking responses. In my research on research, it works out to about 70% of fraud gets through data cleaning, which
Mm,
is really problematic. On
yeah.
the other hand, if you just have really good fraud detection, you still need to clean your data because there are people who are qualified respondents who just give garbage responses. They're actually slightly more likely to speed and straight line and give garbage open ends, non differentiated responses than are the fraudsters because these are real people and they're not professionalized fraudsters. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. I think
Mm,
there's this idea that
mm,
fraud and inattention are really one, when in fact the overlap's a lot smaller, I think, than people
yeah.
realize.
Yeah. I heard from somebody recently that they thought the rates of fraud were even higher, significantly higher. And I just want to talk about that a bit because, you know, how do you feel just kind of hearing that, and this is somebody who, maybe I'll be able to interview them at some point on air, but they're on the brand side and they're skeptical, they're suspicious right now. They've had some alarm bells going off. So is it that bad, or are we safely saying, well, you've got to clean up less than 40% or something? Like,
It
what
might
do you
be more
think?
than 40. I mean, in my research on research, if you take away the fraud and the inattention, you're left with about 50% of the B2C sample.
Yeah.
So, that's going to vary. And I think the rates at which Research Defender flags fraud varies pretty widely. In any given survey, we'll block somewhere between 20 and 40% of traffic. And we scan, we score, we block before it gets in. And that 20 to 40 holds most of the time. You can
Yeah.
imagine some things that make it 20 are like when you're going to a US based B2C audience and your sampling criteria are pretty loose. That's going to be a low value target in lots of
Mhm.
ways. And where incentives are lower, we tend to see a little bit less fraud. We can talk about what the
Yeah.
fraud looks like. The fraud between high and low incidence looks different. I'll set that aside. We can come around to it later.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
there's so much to come back to.
Where you see a
And
lot,
we'll talk about that.
totally, where you see a lot more fraud, maybe we're blocking 30, 40, 50. I've seen defender block rates upwards of 50%, but it tends to be a very narrow audience with
Yeah.
a really large sample size. Like essentially, whenever researchers are really straining the ecosystem,
Yeah.
we tend not to get droves more of qualified respondents. We tend to get a lot more fraudsters. And so Research Defender has to work a lot harder.
Yeah, and
APIs don't really
preferably.
work hard or not, but you know
Yeah,
what I mean? We're going
I
to
do,
see a
yeah.
block rate of 40 to 50%. An example I like to give is we were doing a study about a year ago where we were trying to find 10,000 unique respondents with some targeting criteria in a one US state. It's kind of a
Hmm,
middle-sized state. Is politically very important, which is part of the reason that our client was there. But we were seeing a block rate of, I think, 60%.
hmm,
And the number one block reason code was duplicate entrance because our
hmm.
client was really pushing the upward limit of what was possible in that market.
Interesting, very interesting. I wanna get into markets, but I also I wanna go back to the point of, um, kind of what shifts you've noticed over time, right? And then I wanna get into what shifts you've seen from region to region, so we'll kind of sequence it that way for my own brain. What have you noticed? What is the data revealing about how fraud rates are shifting, how fraud methods are shifting? Is it growing as exponentially, or is this like this has been the case, you're just quantifying it?
Yeah, I will say that there's been an uptick of fraud through the summer months. It started in May, it really took off in June, July, August. It's
Mm,
starting to table off a little bit. I don't cover in the report the para data in September, October, but I can see those now, and things have gone back almost to the pre-summer levels.
mm,
My team, they're probably tired of hearing it. I call it hot fraud summer. The fraud
Huh.
just really took off this summer, and it looked a little bit different. And the big thing that
Interesting.
changed is the rate at which we were blocking people for hyperactivity. And
Hmm.
so Research Defender, it has visibility into all the surveys that Rep Data is running. It also has visibility, again, I should say, not into the surveys, but the data collection process. It also has visibility into the data collection process for all of our clients who are using our research desk, which is our self-serve sampling tool.
Okay.
It also has visibility into various panels and exchanges that are using Research Defender directly for fraud prevention. And so that's where we get to this 4.1 billion number. So it's got this very broad visibility into the survey ecosystem. And one of the really nice things about having such broad visibility is we have a module called activity. And the activity module says, how many times have we seen this respondent across all surveys in the ecosystem in the past 24 hours? How many surveys have they attempted just in the past 24 hours? And traditionally, well, I should say those values range from like 0, 1, 2, 3. Those are unique, fresh eyes. If someone's attempted 3 surveys, they probably haven't even taken one, because we know the conversion for online surveys
Yeah.
is lower than we'd like, right? They've probably been screened out, whatever. So if someone has fewer than 10, they've maybe taken a survey, maybe 2 surveys in the last 24 hours. If someone's attempted or been exposed to 70, 80 surveys, then they've probably
Hmm.
taken about 10, and that's
Yeah.
probably maybe more than we want them to take. But we
Yeah.
see every day people that attempt 200, 300. Not every day, but often we'll see someone who's attempted 1,000 or more. So you can
Yeah.
imagine that distribution has a really long right tail. For those at home, I am always drawing distributions with my hands. But that there's a long right tail, which is to say there's a couple weirdos in every survey who've attempted hundreds or thousands of surveys.
That's
And that
interesting.
number has gone up considerably from sort of the Q1 into Q2, and started to trail off just a little bit now that we've, Q3 into Q4.
There are implications. I'm sure the people listening, are gonna be thinking through the implications of that, like, like, I wonder if that level of detail and data now will influence when surveys launch, because
Yeah.
that's interesting to me.
It is interesting. I mean, we just saw, and it was a global phenomenon. There was a lot of hyperactivity at the beginning of the year. Hyperactive respondents as a percentage of the fraud we blocked was 4, 5, 6 points. At the high point this summer, it was 16, 17,
Mm,
18% of the traffic we were blocking were because respondents had attempted dozens or hundreds of surveys in the past 24
yeah,
hours.
yeah,
You could see there was this demand on the survey ecosystem. And it wasn't like new people were being impaneled to take those surveys. They were, fraudsters who were heroically stepping in to
interesting,
attempt hundreds of surveys.
interesting. Alright, let's talk about regionality too, because I think that's another really interesting to call out. So, what were you seeing in terms of increased fraud, decreased fraud, or just prevalence of fraud?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, of course, we know that the distribution of where surveys are conducted is not even, right? So much survey research is conducted in the US relative to other markets. We see a lot, obviously, in the UK, Germany, Japan, Mexico, Brazil. There's sort of markets where a lot of people are surveying. And
Mm,
those markets have slightly different fraud patterns than the smaller markets. What we see is where there's more demand, there's a more diverse set of fraud flags. So in the US, for example, where there's the most survey research going on, hyperactivity is important, and so are duplicate entrants. People just
mm,
attempting the same survey again and again.
yeah,
Those are really important, but relative to the total amount of fraud, they're much smaller.
hmm,
So in the US, we see a lot more location based fraud, people
yeah,
using tech to pretend they're in the US when they're not.
mm,
We see that in other big markets like Germany, the UK, Japan, where we see a lot of location based fraud. There's just a lot more of tech enabled fraud in these markets. Whenever we move into this, again, another long right tail, but when we move into sort of tier 2, tier 3 countries where there's less survey research going on, but they're still really business critical for lots of companies, the fraud looks different. There's just a lot more duplicate entrants. There's a lot more hyperactivity, but we don't see the professionalization of fraud in
Mm.
those markets as much. We don't see as much people using emulators and web proxies. We don't see as much batch fraud, which is a new kind of fraud we started measuring in about May of this year.
And where are you
Those are
seeing those things? Where are you seeing that type of fraud?
we see those things, especially batch fraud, in the big markets, right? Where there's a lot going on. So it's a volume game. You
Yeah.
know, in the US, especially for a low value target, so it's, a Gen Pop sort of survey where incentives are low, it's more a volume game. People are trying to manipulate the survey and take it again and again and again because they're not getting much from each survey response. So it has to be like the broken vending machine where you're getting Cheetos, 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 right?
Yeah.
And so we started detecting batch fraud in May, and we've rolled that out now. And batch fraud is where we get essentially we see an attack of a survey where we might get 30 entrants in a minute or two, and the entrants are identical in terms of the survey responses that they provide our client, but the markers for the digital fingerprint are incrementally different. So people are manipulating sort of elements in their user agent, and we're talking by one letter or one number.
Hmm.
And they're getting in and essentially like sort of copying and pasting, so to speak, their responses to the entire survey, but just manipulating one piece of their user profile, or I should say their user agent, to be able to get into that survey again and again and again. And that has, again, it accounts for less than 1% of the fraud we block, but it's only happening in the US and a couple top markets, really,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's a volume game, and that's why
Yeah.
they do it.
So let's talk about the differences in the types of studies, B2B, B2C specifically, because I think this is also really interesting to ponder and knowing that our audience spans both,
Yeah.
or serves, kind of both a business and consumer market. Um, it's stated in your report that B2C was having higher rates of duplicate entries and B2B research was showing more compound and batch fraud. Talk to me a little bit about that. That makes me go, hmm.
Yeah. So the compounds are an interesting thing. The compounds are, I guess I should position this and say there are some things that we're looking for in someone's tech setup that are deterministic. If you use, an emulator, web proxy, developer tools, those are highly correlated with an intent to commit fraud. And
Yeah.
so if we see you using those things, you're more or less blocked. There are
Yeah.
some other things like VPNs and other sorts of configurations that are more probabilistic. And so a VPN alone isn't going to get you kicked out. But if we start to see strange combinations, and this is important because we do see this compound search, this compound block in our B2B audience. You're not going to get kicked out for just using a VPN, but if we see you using a VPN with some other weird stuff, that's
Mm.
essentially what the compound block is. And so we see with the B2B and the high value targets and more expensive CPIs,
Yeah.
um, more of a fraud cocktail.
Mm. Broad cocktail.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to be associated with that term, but
Okay. We'll just put that on our shelf with the other topics.
right. But essentially, there's more effort, and it just makes sense that there would be more effort. The
Yeah.
incentives are higher. It's not a volume game; it's a more precise game. So traditionally, outside of the compound block, we see with the B2B and the high CPI fraudsters that they are doing more with fraud in other parts of the internet. So something that we subscribe to and we maintain lists of known fraudsters, known bad actors. And the list that we subscribe to, like the Max Mind list, especially, some of these are really meant to pick up fraud in other parts of the internet.
Yeah.
And those also light up when we look at this
Interesting.
B2B and high value fraud, because these are people who are committing fraud in other places, and they're not going to bother with the very inexpensive B2C survey. But if they see a really highly specialized ITDM at a company with 2,000 plus employees, whatever, like this is more the professionalized fraudster who's got a lot of tech in place to commit fraud and is just really looking for a big payout less often, as opposed to the high volume fraud, which is, lower incentive, paid out, boom, 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 boom.
It's so interesting to and, disturbing, but also interesting to think about, like, research fraudsters being linked to, fraud. I'm sitting here thinking, like, we're talking about bank fraud, identity
Yeah,
fraud, we're talking about fraud. Like, and I think it's really interesting to suddenly picture that being correlated in my mind,
fully
like that
correlated.
fraudsters are fraudsters, and they're gonna
Yeah,
go big or go home, I guess.
yeah. And we worry about fraud because we worry about research, but fraudsters don't care about research.
They
They're
don't care
just
about
looking for
research.
payouts.
Yeah,
People ask, like, why do we have so much fraud? Is it because we pay respondents? I don't think that's only half of the equation, right? We've been paying
yeah,
respondents forever. I mean,
yeah,
mail surveys used to send $2 bills. It didn't mean they got more fraud because they were sending mail to people. So no, I think what makes fraud so prevalent now is a combination of paying people and then tech enabling people to get in and get those same incentives again and again and again. So it's not
yeah,
just the money. It is the money, to be clear.
yeah.
Vignesh Krishnan, our CTO, he says, robbers rob the bank because that's where the money is, and that's he says it to be cheeky, and so money is the reason
Or
we have
or
fraud,
the
but it's
Louvre,
not
because that's where the jewels are.
exactly, exactly, money's only part of it. It's money and the ability to pretend to be an IT decision maker at a
Yeah,
Fortune 500 company.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
that combination that's deadly.
yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. It brings to mind a lot of questions I have about, things that have been discussed about how do we fight fraud? How do we combat fraud? Obviously, there are tools like your own, but, that's kind of a given also. I think about the debate about should we pay people more? And I'm like, gosh, if we start paying participants more, then you know what's going to happen? Like my brain is all of a sudden like, yeah, then more fraudsters are going to be like, ooh, better payouts. So I
Yeah.
don't know that that's the solution. So what's kind of your take on, what else can be done other than, put programs in place to, clean data, prevent fraud, from a tool standpoint in the industry? What else can be done by survey designers, survey researchers?
I mean, I think there's at least three things that every researcher can do, right? And the first, and then this is the one that people don't like to hear, but the first is design really good studies.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you know, I get in trouble. Sometimes I'll feel a little salty and I'll say something on like LinkedIn or whatever social media we're allowed to use to say there's no such thing as a good survey over 20 minutes. And people get so mad.
Mm,
Like, of course there is. Like, would you take a 30-minute survey?
yeah,
So the first thing that every researcher can do is design a really user respondent friendly survey. Have the
mm,
respondent in mind. Imagine that they're probably taking this on a cell phone.
yeah,
Imagine that this isn't the most exciting topic to them.
yeah,
And so if we consider the respondent and write a really user-friendly respondent, low respondent burden survey, we're already better.
yeah,
The next thing is to have fraud prevention in place. Every survey needs fraud prevention,
yeah,
frankly. If you have incentives, you need fraud prevention.
yeah,
Full stop. And then the
yeah,
third thing is to clean the data.
yeah,
Have It's always good to have going into your data collection standards of what constitutes high quality data before you go in. A
yeah,
concern is the data start to come in, you don't like the results, and then maybe you sort of are putting together sort of post hoc reasoning to throw out respondents. That's not great science, right?
yeah,
So the better thing is, to have standards going into data collection of like, these are the things that we're watching for. Maybe there are these questions that we think are incompatible with one another. I'm not the biggest advocate for really strong attention checks. We can set that aside. See point one about
yeah,
respondent experience, right?
yeah,
But if every researcher thinks about designing for the experience, having fraud prevention, and then having standards for data cleaning, I think they're going to get a much better signal to noise ratio.
yeah, yeah. So remember I told you that, like, at about a certain time I'm going to
Yeah.
start to be like, man, we got to wrap and we are nowhere near done with this interview. But this is the point where I'm going to say to you, like, what else from this report didn't we talk about? Is there something else we're missing that's, a high level, that was really interesting data to you?
I think one of the biggest findings we did talk about was this hyperactivity.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. I think another thing we didn't talk about this in the report is that um, flags vary by supplier. but every supplier has flags, which is
Yeah.
to say that the fraud is pervasive.
Yeah.
And we don't know if it's because the supplier themselves are in turn, aggregating and we don't see it. But it seems like from what we observe that there is some amount of fraud, sometimes single digit, often double digit in
Yeah.
every supply that we look at. And so
Yeah.
um, it's not to say there's no such thing as a clean sample, but they're hard to come by. And so everyone should be vigilant regardless.
Yeah.
Our approach is to work with suppliers that we trust, but we don't trust them to deliver fraud free. And that's why
Yeah.
that's why we exist, is to put that fraud detection on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good mantra actually. So, thank you for sharing that. Talk to us about how people can get this report. What is the plan for distribution of it? What
Yeah.
do you have? What do you have for folks?
Sure. So we'll be rolling it out pretty widely. Right now, we've already done a webinar sort of outlining the main findings of the report that's available on the Rep Data website. I'm sure you can find it on LinkedIn, but that's available to folks now today. We also have a couple of different reports that we're rolling out over the next few weeks. Those will all be available on the Rep Data website as well, and I'm sure they'll get pushed out to the social media.
Absolutely. All right, cool. Cool, cool. So now here's kind of the big takeaway. We talked about what people could do. Green Book, we always talk about the future of insights, right? That's sort of our motto, our mantra. And part of our mission is to make sure that people are ready for it. So what does the future look like when it comes to data integrity, trust in data quality and fraud prevention? Like, what does the future of the industry look like to you with that lens?
Yeah, I'll say I'm reasonably optimistic. I spent time this week with um, a leader of a large research group at a tech company, and she expressed concern that AI and innovation makes it easier for us to detect fraud, and some of that's true. But AI also makes it easier for people to commit fraud, which we're
Right.
seeing. We've
Yeah.
we've built into Research Defender um, checks for markers of uh, AI enabled open end responses, right? For
Yeah.
example. So I'm still reasonably optimistic, but the future 100% is going to be very technical.
Yeah.
And I don't think researchers need to be experts in API calls. I don't think we need to necessarily um, do those things, but I think we need to be eyes wide open,
Yeah.
that we need to be at least as smart as the fraudsters. The
Yeah.
fraudsters are motivated by money.
Yeah.
So are we, right? Truly, right? So is everybody who's in this business. And so we need to be at least as smart as the fraudsters. And we need to continue to make investments into tech to stay in front of fraud. And we as a company, that is what we do. So of course we're going to do it. But
Yeah.
that's, I think, everybody who's interested in high quality insights is going to need to think, what am I buying? And is there a sufficient investment in the tech to be smarter than the fraudsters?
Yeah. That's the goal. Smarter than the fraudsters. Be smarter than the fraudsters, folks. Um, Stephen, thank you. This has been just a great hour talking about this deeply important critical topic. So I'm so glad you joined us. I'm so glad we dug into this report in this way.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, I can't wait to just keep learning more. Thank you for doing research on research. I think that that's something at the heart of every researcher is a curiosity for what's out there. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation, Karen.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And to everybody else, thank you to our editor, Big Bad Audio. Well, I always have to thank Bridget for showing up to produce at all hours of the day. We appreciate you. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We are just, happy to be bringing you these important topics. And like I said, this particular conversation is one we need to be having. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.